Today, I'd like to be talking about a few topics, one of which is, of course, the Barça v Young Boys fixture that ended 5-0 in favor of Barcelona in the Champions League. Frenkie de Jong's return, what that means for the club. Ansu Fati's return and what his trajectory is looking like. And then, of course, amongst other things, we'll be discussing Hansi Flick and how he will be, or could be, lining up as Barcelona face Deportivo Alavés on Sunday. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Driven Shot podcast. My name is Omar Hawwash and this podcast is in collaboration between Blaugranagram and Mundo Deportivo. If you're watching this, you're probably watching it on Mundo Deportivo's YouTube channel. If you're listening to it, you'll be able to find it on Spotify and the likes. So if you're listening on Spotify, you can go over and watch it on Mundo Deportivo's YouTube channel. And if you're watching it on the YouTube channel and you want to go do something else but still listen and hear what's going on here, you can do that on Spotify, Apple Music, and so on, just by searching for The Driven Shot. Now, usually I'm here with my good friend Jamie Coles, but he's out on other duties at the moment, and so I will be doing this episode solo. Now, today I'd like to be talking about a few topics, one of which is, of course, the Barça v Young Boys fixture that ended 5-0 in favor of Barcelona in the Champions League, bouncing back, of course, from the loss of 2-1 to Monaco earlier this September. And another thing that I will be touching upon, of course, in correlation with that fixture, is Frenkie de Jong's return, what that means for the club, Ansu Fati's return and what his trajectory is looking like. And then, of course, amongst other things, we'll be discussing Hansi Flick and how he will be, or could be, lining up as Barcelona face Deportivo Alavés on Sunday. So, first things first, a player that has been very heavily discussed is Ferran Torres. Of course, he played against Young Boys in the 5-0 fixture and, again, failed to really impress. Young Boys are a club that hasn't really achieved too much in the Champions League. They've never really been a team to really push through in recent years anyways. And so with Ferran Torres starting, a lot of fans were left thinking, well, maybe this will be the game where he actually comes out on top. Now, for Ferran, as I've mentioned previously, I mentioned this on the last episode of The Driven Shot. If you haven't watched that, you can find it on Mundo Deportivo's YouTube channel or on Spotify and Apple Music and wherever you listen to your podcasts, as you can find with all the other episodes. But what I mentioned then with Ferran was the problem for me seems to be that, well, first of all, his confidence is an issue or lack thereof. And the second thing is when he's playing with Spain, it's different to when he's playing with Barça. So when he's playing with Barça, he'll be doing things differently than when he plays with Spain. The tactics are different. His role is different. When he's playing through the middle is different to when he's playing on the wing. When he started playing through the middle, we saw a different Ferran Torres. When he started making those runs through the middle, trying to link up play through the middle, he instantly looked a more dangerous player. And yes, he didn't score, but he got pretty close, which is more than you can say for what he did for the majority of the game where he was pushed out to the wing. Now, with Ferran, he's naturally a winger, or at least that's what he was at Valencia. That's what he played at with Manchester City. And so, of course, when you come to Barcelona, you're expected to kind of keep going on that in that same lane. But with Hansi Flick's tactics and what he expects from his wingers, Ferran is not that type of winger. He's not the type of winger that Hansi Flick needs in this side. Rafinha is, but part of what makes Rafinha's play and what he brings to the table special is because if he's not scoring a goal, he's setting it up. And if he's not setting it up, he's running and running and running and running all the time. he constantly has something he's adding, even in the absence of direct goal contributions or even indirect goal contributions. He's constantly adding something. Ferran does not have that factor, which is fair enough because not all players have that factor. I think the last time we saw that factor from a forward player in Barcelona was probably Antoine Griezmann, and we all saw how that ended, with the Frenchman, of course, going back to Atleti. So with Ferran, the real problem is figuring out where does he fit into this Hansi Flick side, this ideology that the German coach has for how a team plays. Where does he fit into that equation? The answer to that question might be he doesn't, in which case he'll have to just resort to being a bench player. And in that case, when you are Ferran Torres and you're as young as you are, and you were touted for greatness throughout your career, would it not make more sense to maybe ply your trade elsewhere? Which I do think is ultimately the direction that Ferran Torres and Barcelona seem to be heading if things don't change for Ferran. Because we saw him at the start of last season, the whole Tiburon vibe that he had going on, the whole, confidence and confidence and confidence. Confidence breeds goals and all this talk. And to be fair to him, he showed it for a good portion of the start of last season and then sort of slowly fell off as Barcelona slowly fell off of the projection that we had for them at the start of the season and how everything was going. And it did seem like for a while that Ferran finally might have found his spot in this Barcelona team. We saw him deployed as a false nine, saw him deployed as somewhat of a 10. And I think the important thing here to note is every single time Ferran has had a somewhat decent or good performance for Barcelona, he's been playing through the middle. So having him out on the wing, he's not the player you want beating a defender on one-on-one. He's not the player to do that. He can do that sometimes. Rarely. It's not his strength. Really, it's not his strength. His strength is running in behind. His strength is his runs off the ball, getting into good positions. Now, what we've seen from Ferran is he gets into a good position, he receives the ball, he loses the ball. Or he gets into a good position, receives the ball, makes a move that looks like it's going in the right direction, then passes it back to someone. Instead of progressing the play regresses instead. And that also comes down to confidence because when you look at the players that we've seen over the last 5-10 years with Barcelona, Felipe Coutinho springs to mind immediately. Because the problem with Coutinho was a problem of does he fit the tactics and does he have the confidence? With Griezmann, the problem wasn't the confidence, it was the tactics. With Coutinho, it was both. With Ferran Torres, it is both. Because you can tell when you look at Ferran, he does not have the confidence he had when he was playing under Xavi, when he was playing as the false nine. When he's playing with Spain, his confidence is different. He's a different type of player. He's not the type of player that necessarily wants to be the star or the focal point, but he is the type of player that can be that. Problem is, with Spain, it's very different. The way they play is different. His role in the team is different. Looking at the call-ups, the national team call-up for Spain here for the game against Denmark and the game against Serbia, Ferran is called up. Right? Now, Inigo Martinez was one of the options because Robin Lenormand is obviously out, so won't be playing. And the option then, one of them was Inigo Martinez. Now, De La Fuente opted for Pau Torres, who's been doing quite well recently in England, and so Inigo won't be playing. But Pedri has been picked, Lamine Yamal has been picked, Pau Cubarsí has been picked. Those three are starters for Barcelona. They're not just starters; they're some of the stars for Barcelona. And then you look at the rest of the list, and Ferran Torres is on the list. And for a lot of fans of Barcelona followers, they go, how did he make the list? He made the list because he's good with Spain, because he still is a quality player. The problem is he can't seem to get that quality out with Barcelona, but he can with Spain. And I bet you if you watch the game against Denmark and the game against Serbia, and he does play, he will do a very good job because the role there fits him better than it does at Barcelona. And that's just a fact. Now, when you do come to that conclusion, there are two options, as I mentioned previously. One is you just say, okay, we just have to cut our losses. That's just the way it is. That's the situation it is for Ferran Torres. And then maybe either he'll be a starter for Barcelona in the absence of other options due to injury, due to players still finding their form, like an Ansu Fati, or Barca sell him on in January, or use him as some sort of a swap deal for a different type of player needed in a different position, whether that's a holding midfield, whether that's a more permanent goalkeeper, whatever that is. So those are realistically the two options for Ferran and for Barcelona in that regard. But there still is a quality player in there somewhere. And I think that's where that's why the frustration is there for Barcelona fans, because there is a player in there. We know there is. We've seen him. We've seen him perform. We've seen him score goals. We've seen him set up his teammates. But it's not happening right now. And the reason is that it's the tactics that Hansi Flick wants and the players around him, the way they're playing, does not suit Ferran. And that's okay. But then you got to find a solution, which could be a deal away or somehow revamping him into a player, molding him into a player that fits the Hansi Flick system. And he's still quite young, so it's not impossible to do that. It's just not easy to do that. So that's the Ferran topic. Now, Barcelona won 5-0 against BS Young Boys in the Champions League. And it was a commanding 5-0 victory in many regards. The goals were by Lewandowski. He got a brace. He's on fire. He's in very, very fine form at the moment. Rafinha got a goal. Inigo Martinez scored his first goal in the Champions League since joining Barcelona 2 seasons ago. And then the last goal was technically an own goal by Camara, who had a very good game otherwise. But Alejandro Balde went in for a cross, a low-driven one, and it ended up bouncing off of Camara and ending up in the back of the net. So that was a 5-0 victory, and Barcelona were quite commanding in that game. One thing I did notice, though, was that Young Boys, as opposed to what you'd expect from some of the smaller, objectively smaller or less successful, shall we say, sides, is that they would go in and try to disrupt the flow of Barcelona's game. We've seen that with Getafe. We've seen that with some of the other clubs as well. And some clubs just pride on doing that. Getafe pride on doing that. Atleti pride on disrupting the flow in some games, depending on some of the opponents that they face. Rather than take the game to them, they'd rather take the game from them. And the interesting thing was that Young Boys did not do that. Young Boys said, well, we want to play with possession. You want to play with possession. We're going to try to play with possession. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But we're not going to disrupt the flow of your game. We're going to try to defend with ours. And I think that is a very respectable performance by a team who, quite frankly, isn't really touted to do too well in this Champions League edition. But the interesting part of this whole league system now, this new format of the Champions League, is that you do get to see a lot of teams face off that you really wouldn't see, at least not this early on in the competition anyway. So it does make for more interesting scorelines, more entertaining games overall, interesting tactics, interesting tests for players and coaches alike. And I think this was one of them for both sides. Now, for the interesting aspects of this game, I think, of course, Marc Casado springs to mind. He was excellent, as always. And the thing I fear with Casado is the Pedri syndrome. I do fear that we will get to a stage where we'll say, oh, he's played too many matches now. He needs to be rested. I do think Hansi Flick's management has shown that he won't be doing that. But, needs musts. So it is not improbable to think that Barcelona will be at a stage where they will need to utilize Marc Casado more than they maybe would have liked to, just to rest him physically and mentally, of course, as well. But we'll see. I mean, Cubarsí, of course, is also a player that I think 2-3 years ago, if you said that name to people, they probably wouldn't really recognize him, or at the very least would not expect him to be near the first team as much as he is now. But fact of the matter is, he's at a point now where I've seen a lot of fans on social media talk about when Ronald Araujo comes back, who does he replace? Because Inigo has done well, as has Pau Cubarsí. Not to mention you have Andreas Christensen in the mix. You have Jules Koundé, who is playing as a right back, and quite frankly, to me, is the best right back in the world right now. Consistency-wise, composure-wise, defensively, offensively, he's the complete package, Jules Koundé. And considering that he's naturally a center back, it is extremely impressive what he's putting up and the numbers he's putting up. But it does beg the question. So when Araujo comes back, who should he replace? Or is he going to have to just fight his way back like any other player who's joining a new team? Because he's not joining a new team. He's one of the pillars of this team and has been for a long time. And so now when he joins back, coming back from a long-term injury, what happens then? So for you fans and you followers and people listening, let us know in the comments. I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on this because it is a topic that's being quite heavily discussed. And it will be interesting to see how that pans out. So two things, of course, are the return of Ansu Fati and that of Frenkie de Jong. Um, Frenkie de Jong's return, of course, means that Casado does not have to play as much. Maybe Pedri won't have to play as much. But it fully does depend on, of course, how Frenkie de Jong does and his availability in the team. Now, for Frenkie, of course, the question is, can he get back to the form he used to show? And the other question is, if he does, where does he fit into Hansi Flick's puzzle? Because Hansi Flick has spoken very highly of Frenkie de Jong since arriving at Barcelona as the new head coach. And I think Frenkie undisputably is one of the most important players for Barcelona, has been since he joined from Ajax, and continues to be a player that definitely brings something different. But the problem for Frenkie in recent times, before his injury, has been that he was deployed in a role where you really felt like his potential just wasn't being maximized. He was being put into positions where you felt like it's kind of highlighting his shortcomings. He's in a more defensive position. He's not as defensive a player as he should be in that position because that's just not who Frenkie is. So having him in a more defensive role highlights his shortcomings. And when he does get the ball, he can't do what Frenkie does because he's getting it in a deeper position than he should be getting it in, or he's getting it under more pressure than he should be getting it in. Those kinds of questions, I think, are ones that Hansi Flick definitely will want answered and definitely will have answered as the teams continue their training sessions, continue their games. Of course, the next one is in the Basque Country against Alavés on Sunday at 4:15 p.m. local time. And we will be covering it, of course, both on Mundo Deportivo and on Blaugranagram. So you can stay tuned for that. But the return of Ansu Fati, I think, is a more interesting one because for Frenkie, it does kind of seem like the puzzle will fall into place eventually. It does seem like I do imagine personally after a couple of matches, Hansi Flick will kind of be clear in the head about where Frenkie fits in because Frenkie is going to fit in. I don't think that's up for debate. I really don't because he's a quality player. We've all seen that. We all know that, and his ceiling is still extremely high for a midfielder of his age. So for Hansi Flick, it's going to be a no-brainer about fitting him in. It's just a matter of how. But for Ansu Fati, it's different because Ansu Fati burst onto the scene, did extremely well, then got hit by an injury, and since then he's just not been the same. He got loaned out to Brighton, got injured there as well under Roberto De Zerbi's side. Roberto De Zerbi, of course, now with Marseille, and just hasn't really looked the same. We saw in the last game before the Young Boys game where he was warming up and he was almost going to come on and then he didn't. And then against Young Boys he came on and he looked so happy. He looked so happy to be on the pitch, which was great to see. And it was also his first Champions League outing under Hansi Flick. And for Ansu, it does really pose a question because the situation is Barcelona do not, at this point, have a left winger that they can rely on fully. They don't. Every other position is covered. Right wing, covered. Rafinha, Lamine Yamal. Striker, covered. Lewandowski. You have Pau Victor, potentially. So, and then the left wing is sort of been Rafinha, Lamine Yamal, Lewandowski. That's sort of how it's been. So if Ansu comes on, he's going to come on for one of those three. Now, Ansu Fati, we've seen him play as a false nine. He's a good finisher. We've seen him do quite well there. He could potentially be a Lewandowski replacement. Now, would that be the best use of his potential? Maybe not. But when you do have Rafinha and Lamine Yamal fully fit, and you have Dani Olmo fully fit, and Pedri fully fit, Ansu is probably not going to play over Olmo. If he does, You're going to have an unhappy Olmo on the bench, given that he's just signed. I imagine Barcelona will want to manage expectations. And Olmo, to be fair, has shown very, very good form in his first games for Barcelona. So I don't really see him getting dropped unless his form does. So having Ansu come on for him, I don't think we'll see much of, although I would like to see Ansu in the 10. I just don't think that's the position for him. But I do think him as a false 9 could work. More of an attacking 10, if that makes sense. So not as much a number 10, but more of like a striker. So that's going to be interesting to see how that goes for Ansu Fati and Frenkie de Jong. On that note, thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the Driven Shot podcast. It was brought to you in collaboration between Blaugranagram and Mundo Deportivo. I have been Omar Hawwash, and thank you for your time. Have a great rest of your day, and stay safe.